Good morning, lovelies. Today we are talking about writing diverse characters in science fiction and fantasy. This video is designed primarily for authors of privileged social groups who want to include major characters of minority groups in their sci-fi fantasy works. So for example, white authors who want to include characters of color, men who want to write women, cishet people who want to write LGBTQ+ characters, etc. P.S. Cishet is shorthand for cisgender heterosexual. Before we get started, remember to click that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss another video. I post every Sunday, usually with bonus videos on other days of the week. This video is going to be a little on the longer end because we have a lot to talk about with this subject. So I've included the timestamps of the specific topics within this subject in the description of the video. So if you want to skip ahead to a certain part that you are having trouble with, be my guest. For starters, let's talk about the debates around diversity in science fiction and fantasy. Now, this debate over whether or not privileged authors should include characters from minority groups in their writing exists on a spectrum with two extremes. On one extreme, it's
you're not allowed to write characters in minority groups you're not a part of. It's not your story. It's not your place. Leave it to the authors of those minority groups.
On the other end of the extreme, it is
you have to jam back your story with as many diverse characters as possible, or else you're a racist, sexist, ableist, homophobic jerk.
Both of these extremes are wrong. They are extremes. Writing is about putting yourself in other people's shoes. So if you can imagine what it's like to be a dragon rider or an alien prince, I mean, how hard is it to imagine a person of color doing these things or someone who's trans doing these things? Having said that, writing diversity is intimidating, especially in today's society where people can easily broadcast your mistakes all over social media and call you some really nasty things if you mess up. So we come to whether or not you should do it. If you've clicked this video, you're probably an author who thinks they should be writing more diversity in their stories for whatever reason, and honestly, I applaud you for that. A lot of writers don't think that. In my personal opinion, we definitely need more minority characters in all genres. We also need more minority authors in those genres. If you're going to write fictional people in these groups, you should also support real people in these groups. Authors should challenge themselves to write diverse characters. Your readers will thank you, and honestly, in this process, as you're researching and writing and empathizing with these characters, it's going to broaden your own horizons in real life. But understand that you are not an expert. Now, what do I mean by that? White authors can and should, honestly, talk about race, but not racism. This would be like a guy trying to explain sexism to me. Like, dude, I am a woman. I experience sexism firsthand. Do not try to patronize me about this. It's that same thing. I would never try to lecture a person of color about racism any more than I would appreciate a man doing the same thing with sexism to me. Fine line, bit of a gray area. I get it. Honestly, I could spend an entire video doing just this, but at this point, we gotta move on. Tell us your thoughts in the comments. We will gladly debate them. So once you've decided that you're going to write diverse characters in your stories, you got to put yourself in the correct mindset, which is you will probably screw up. Maybe you'll screw up in your story. It could be something like a minor detail, or maybe your narrative arc accidentally fails the Nakamori test. More on that later. Or you could screw up on your author platform on social media or some other area within your writing career. Now you may think,
oh, Chris, come on. I'm a liberal. I'm not going to mess this up. I know how to be politically correct. It's fine.
Look, you may be liberal, you may have been born and raised in a liberal household, you may have graduated from a liberal college with a bachelor's degree in social justice. And even with all that, you could still go on Twitter and make a very insensitive tweet that gets a lot of Black Twitter on your ass. I don't know how many of you know about Justina Ireland. She's a Black author, she's amazing, she did the Dread Nation series. Read it when you get the chance. Anyway, I follow her on Twitter, And she made this tweet saying how she didn't know why they cast Gal Gadot for the new Cleopatra movie when we have someone like Nakia from Black Panther right there. And of course I pointed out that, well, thanks to Alexander the Great and a crap ton of inbreeding, Cleopatra was actually white. So Gal Gadot is a good choice. Factually accurate, really insensitive, especially when you consider the long history of whitewashing and blackface that Hollywood has. So I got chewed out by one of my favorite authors and her fans about this issue. Obviously the tweet has been deleted. You learn from your mistakes, you apologize when necessary, and you move on. You're not a monster unless you make yourself a monster. On the other hand, you are not some great big hero for adding a few non-white, non-cishet, disabled, neurodiverse characters in your book. You are doing what many people would argue is the bare minimum. Don't let your head get too big for your shoulders. A lot of authors are intimidated about writing characters from minority groups when they're not a part of them because they're afraid of causing undue offense to people in those groups. Now, of course, I've heard the argument, usually from other authors, that,
well, if you write something, you're going to offend somebody, and there's no way that your story won't ever offend anybody, so you're just gonna have to stick with it.
And while this is true, aim for which groups you want to offend. Do you want to offend the racist, sexist, homophobic KKK folks? Or do you want to offend the groups that have already been shoved into the dirt for the last 400 years? Choose wisely. One way to gain confidence with writing diverse characters is to start with the minor characters in your story and then gradually work your way up to major. So, for example, in your current book that might have a power trio, for instance, all three of those characters may be white, but one of their mentor characters is Chinese, or one of the allies that they have a long scene with is black. And then in your next book, that also features a power trio, two of those characters are white, one of them is Latino. Rick Riordan did this. You can actually see him gain more confidence and knowledge with writing diverse characters from this first Percy Jackson book to the last Trials of Apollo book, and it's really fascinating. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be talking about writing diversity among significant minor through major characters. So, for instance, if your story is the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe franchise, we're looking at Black Widow or Doctor Strange or higher in terms of character significance. So this is all well and good, but how do you actually make a diverse character if you are not from that diverse group? Well, you start with the character. Some of you may have heard this bit of advice when it comes to writing women characters specifically, which is you make a character and then you make him a woman. That works about 9 out of 10 times, and the same goes for any minority group. Ideally, you would start with your story and what characters you need, and then choose which one of those major characters are going to be diverse. So for the purposes of this video, let's make a story. Let's say we're going to be doing an urban fantasy about a secret underworld of demons that need to be hunted in Chicago. And the premise of this book is that the main character finds out that demons are a thing and goes to a demon hunting boot camp in order to learn how to fight back the demons. This could be a standalone, it could be the start of a trilogy. At this point, we're not going to worry about that. What we're going to focus on is that this story is about a magical boot camp, which means there are going to be a lot of characters. Your main character, all their friends and allies that they're going to make in boot camp, their enemies and rivals, bunch of mentor characters, maybe a love interest. Roughly sketch out each of the major stories that you need for the story. Yes, even you pantsers, I'm not asking you to make a whole freaking outline, just tell me who the big players are. What do they bring to the story? Maybe a little bit of their arc. And then pick and choose which ones you want to be diverse. So if this is the first time we're really doing a major diverse character, we'll have our main character who's a student in this boot camp. We'll have them be a white, straight, cishet guy. But the mentor in this boot camp, we'll have them be a drill sergeant in her 40s or 50s, name her Jennifer, and make her transgender. Done. Well, okay, not quite done yet. Before we get started into the actual story parts of this, I want to give a brief shout out to intersectionality. Now that's a big word, but what intersectionality means is it is the interconnected nature of different social categories as they apply to specific groups and individuals. You may have heard, the argument of super diverse characters that
Well, it's just so hard to believe that a character could be black and a woman and bisexual and in a wheelchair.
Why? Black, bi, women with disabilities exist. It's not that hard to believe. White people don't have a monopoly on gay, trans, or disabled people. They exist among other ethnic and racial groups, and those ethnic and racial groups are chock full of other diversities, women, LGBTQ plus people, people with disabilities, people who are neurotypical, that type of thing. And all those identities affect those groups and individuals in different ways. Intersectionality is fascinating, and studying it is a study of how different pressures affect people in those shared groups, and you get to add even more layers when you include your fantasy and science fiction rules. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that you don't have to choose just one minority identity for your characters. So let's take a closer look at our drill sergeant Jenny here. If she is transgender and a war veteran, both of those groups are at higher risk for mental health issues like anxiety, depression, and PTSD. So we might see some of that in this story. She doesn't have to be white. She could be Mexican. Maybe her thing is that she swears in Spanish and the main character doesn't understand it, but one of the other characters, maybe his friend or ally or rival or whatever, does, and when he asks for a translation, she's just like, "You don't want to know what our drill sergeant is saying." On the flip side, Jenny herself could have prejudices against other minority groups. She could be sexist, she could be racist, she could be ableist, she could be whatever. Let's say that our main character is descended from demons or half demon himself. That's probably going to cause a lot of issues in a story that's about learning how to hunt down and kill demons. And Jennifer may see this person and be like, wow, I wonder how long he's gonna last before I have to kill this one too. Tons of possibilities here, literally infinite, go nuts. The best thing about writing what you know is that you can always know more. And with the age of the internet, you have no excuse not to do your research. When it comes to creating and writing about diverse characters, even in science fiction and fantasy, you need to do your research. And there are two major things that you need to look into. One is minority groups in real life, and two, minority tropes to avoid in fiction. So let's talk real quick about tropes in fiction. Each minority group has their own laundry list of really harmful tropes and cliches that we're just so freaking sick of seeing. It harms us in real life that just don't write them, please. Now, like I said, each group is different, but all those tropes tend to fall into one of two categories. Either the minority character's entire arc, entire state of being revolves around the privileged character, and or they die. So for example, the woman in the refrigerator, the black guy dies first, the barrier gays, they all center around death. So let's talk about the narrative arc first. When the Pacific Rim movie came out, they also created this thing called the Makomori test, named after the female lead in that movie. The Makomori test is that you need to have at least one woman with a narrative arc that does not revolve around a guy in your story. Even though this was originally designed for a woman, this can apply to any minority character. So in Jennifer's case, she is an LGBT character with a narrative arc that does not revolve around a cis-het character. Because she's a mentor, her case is going to be a little tricky, but we're going to talk about that later. So use the Makomori test on your diverse characters to make sure that they actually have a character and a life outside of your privileged characters. Now, character death. This one's a little harder and a little more controversial. My personal rule is any minority character you write does not count if you kill them off. So for example, you can write a really great, intriguing, black, disabled character in your science fiction story, but if you kill them off at the halfway point, doesn't count. Much like in real life, fictional characters of minority groups are killed off far more frequently than fictional characters of privileged groups. Only this is not a thing that we really want to imitate in real life, especially since that death of the minority character is usually used as part of the privileged character's narrative arc. For example, the woman in the refrigerator, where you kill off a woman specifically to motivate a man to do the thing. But let's say you're writing a grim, dark story or something that requires a lot of character death and suffering, and you don't want to give these certain characters plot armor just because they happen to be from certain groups. Well, here's how you kill off a minority character. One, you make it a part of their arc. So for example, let's say you have a character of color who has a really dark past and maybe killed a lot of people, made some mistakes, whatever, and they've gone through their redemption arc, they've moved past it, they're a different person now, but those mistakes are coming back to bite them in the butt. That way their death is not just to kickstart a white character's narrative arc, it's because of something they did. The other thing you want to do is to include more minority characters who survive. Remember, if you kill off a minority character, it doesn't really count. But if you include more minority characters, then you're okay. I mean, you should probably add more minority characters anyway, instead of just having that one person who's supposed to represent all black people or all women or whatever, but that's another thing. The Dragon Prince did both of these. They killed off King Harrow because of something he did in his backstory, but he survived through his son. Once you've got a general layout of what tropes and cliches you need to avoid for your minority characters, and you've got a general idea of what their arc should look like, it's time to start researching them in real life. And this can be super general basic stuff. So, in the case of Drill Sergeant Jenny, what is transgender? What does that mean? What is the history of the transgender group? Especially if the story takes place in America, what's the history of transgender people in America, Chicago specifically? What's the deal with meds and surgery, etc. If she needs a military background for the plot, research trans and non-binary people in the military. They are way more common than you think. You can kill two birds with one stone with Facebook groups. I'm not even kidding. I love Facebook specifically for this. Join groups that are specifically about these minority groups, LGBT, transgender rights, etc. Make a post, tell them who you are, tell them what you're doing, and ask them what your question is. You're gonna get about 20 people answering, and you may end up finding some better readers for your story. Also, read science fiction and fantasy books written by people in the minority group you're writing about. So look for sci-fi and fantasy stories written by trans and non-binary people. You get to support a minority author, read a really good book, and get inspiration for your book. Win, win, win. We mentioned narrative arcs earlier on in this video when we talked about the Makomori test, but I want to speak about them more in depth here. Because another mistake that authors make is that they'll have this minority character's entire arc and life revolve around their minority status. Don't get me wrong, sexism and the patriarchy, they're big parts of my life as a woman, but I'm not just trying to fight the patriarchy here. I've got other stuff going on, and that's same with every other woman. This is why we create the characters first and then add the minority issues. If you have their character just be about their minority status and have their story just be about fighting the oppressors, you might be doing this to try to, talk about a message or something, but it ends up dehumanizing your character, and that's really not something you want to do. Now granted, you don't have to give every single character in your story a narrative arc. Most mentors don't have or even need one. A really great example of this is Uncle Iroh in Avatar: The Last Airbender. But let's give an arc to Jenny anyway. Arcs can be anything from silly to serious, from inconsequential to having massive story reproductions and being a part of major plot points. Whatever. Let's do some scenarios for Jenny. We could give her one of the standard mentor arcs. Let's say she's jaded from losing a loved one or a former student from a horrible demon hunting accident, and over the course of the story she gradually learns to open herself up again. Or she's pushing 60 years old but may resist the idea of retiring for whatever reason. We could give her fluffier arcs, that is, after fighting for decades, she's ready to settle down and open up a floral shop. But maybe she's a little insecure about this because she never went to school for business and has no idea how to do it. She'll stay up super late reading all these books on business management and what it is to open and keep up a store. Maybe you can give her a romantic arc. She's trying to work up the courage to ask out that cute non-binary medic who patches everyone up out after their demon fights. but she has no idea how to flirt, so it comes across as really kind of awkward and adorable. Or we could give her a much more serious arc. Maybe she has a family, like an ex-spouse and adult children, maybe even grandchildren, but she had to leave them like 20 years ago because of complicated demon reasons in order to protect them. What happens when the demons find out that that family exists? You get to mount a rescue mission. The main character could help mount a rescue, and it could be a huge part of the story, like a big plot point. And then the fallout of that would be the family, of course, realizing like, wow, this loved one that we thought was dead for 20 plus years is alive. Where the hell were you? Again, infinite possibilities, go nuts. So we have our character, we know her place in the story, she even has her own narrative arc. How do you tell your audience that this character is from this diverse minority group without hammering them over the head with it? You want to be subtle but clear. Don't pull a Rowling and try to retroactively write that this character was gay, this character was trans into your story after you publish it. That is BS. 9 out of 10 times, this conundrum can be solved with just little tiny details. I would recommend trying to tie it in with the character's physical description, if at all possible. Maybe nervous habits or tics. In a very recent Rick Riordan book, he has a Jewish character, and while he never says explicitly she is Jewish, she has a Star of David necklace that she's constantly worrying and playing with whenever she's nervous. If Jenny never took estrogen or got surgery, she might have some very masculine physical features. For instance, maybe she scratches her copper wire beard while thinking. Or if she is able to pass, maybe all of her military service awards displayed in her office are made out to her dead name. The main character comes in to talk about something else entirely. He sees all these and he's like, who the hell is John? And she's like, oh, that was my dead name before I transitioned to Jennifer. Anyway, here's all these demons we gotta kill. If you want to be a little angsty about it, maybe one of her coworkers or students is transphobic, and the main character / audience learns about her identity that way. Tons of possibilities here. Honestly, the big thing is don't stress too much about it. One line here, one line there, that's really all you need. Every manuscript needs another pair of eyes, no more so than when you're including major diverse characters. Find readers and critique partners from those specific groups that your character is in. So in Drill Sergeant Jenny's case, we want to look for people in the LGBTQ+ community as a whole and transgender community specifically. Not just one, multiple, as many as you can agree to read this thing and give you feedback. And actually listen to them when they give you feedback. Otherwise, what's the point? Brace yourself for the fact that you might have messed up and have to do some serious revisions. It is much better to find those problems now than after the book is published and it's too late to fix them. Again, Facebook groups are great for this. Not just writers groups and minority activist groups, but also reading groups. If this is a young adult novel, we're going to want to take it to young adult book groups on Facebook and say, hey, we're looking for beta readers. This is the general concept. Also, I'm looking for some transgender readers specifically because one of our main characters is trans and I want to make sure that I didn't mess up. I literally use that line, usually something along the lines of, I need you guys to tell me all the ways that I messed up when I'm pitching this thing to these various groups to try to get as many readers as possible. And I've gotten several readers that way. Just remember to actually listen to them and incorporate their feedback when they do tell you when you're messing up. That is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Give us your tips of how to write diverse characters in your sci-fi and fantasy stories in the comments. Also, remember to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already and smash that like button. It really helps this channel grow. Bye, lovelies!